Hi, welcome to Governance Bites. I'm Mark Banicevich, and today I'm really lucky to spend some more time with Lloyd Kavanagh. Lloyd, thank you very much for your time again. Lloyd is a senior partner at MinterEllisonRuddWatts, one of the most respected financial services lawyers in New Zealand. He started his career at Rudd Watts & Stone, so he's come full circle, having more than a decade outside of Rudd Watts in the corporate world, particularly in companies like Fonterra, and then returned to the legal profession around the time of the GFC. He's got over 25 years experience in governance, both advising for boards and on boards, both non-for-profit and for-profit boards. He's currently on the board of the National Provident Fund. He's previously served on a diverse range of boards, both in New Zealand and overseas, from Lawyers for Climate Action, AMP Services New Zealand, Soprole, which is a Chilean company that is associated with Fonterra, the predecessor of the Financial Markets Authority, the Securities Commission for a number of years, and also MinterEllisonRuddWatts, and having periods chairing or acting chairing in many of those boards as well. So really experienced governance professional. So thank you very much again, Lloyd, for your time.
Very kind.
And also with your strong legal background, as we had in our last conversation, the strength of knowing your obligations and things from a legal perspective puts you in a really good stead as well. So some really valuable insights from there. Today, what we're going to talk about is climate change and how this is impacting boards around New Zealand and I guess the global awareness as well. So there's a significant global awareness over the last decade or so of climate change. It's increased significantly, and many jurisdictions, including New Zealand, now require climate change disclosures. I think we were the first to pass law on climate change disclosure, weren't we?
Yes, we were.
And so it's a really interesting topic, and directors of boards are presently spending a lot of time considering the impact of this. So what risks exist for companies around climate change? I mean, you're in a law firm. What impact do you have?
So this is a great topic, and one that's dear to my heart, having spent 4 years on the board of Lawyers for Climate Action, amongst other things. But I think my starting point is to understand that climate change is essentially about financial risk and opportunities for most boards and companies. That's not to diminish the important moral imperatives and the reputational issues, but the first way to think about this is there is a change in the environment, actually literally, which has a number of impacts. Now, you highlighted risks. I think it's important to realise there are also opportunities here, and it's not all downside. But so I prefer to call them impacts rather than risks per se. And in a sense, if climate change is happening, as certainly the global scientific community believes, and I believe is the case,
last year's rainfall suggests,
then actually being in New Zealand is as good as it gets in the world, and we should bear that in mind. But just unpicking that, what are the impacts? They fall mainly into two camps, and then there's a third one that'll add, and these kind of come originally from the Financial Stability Board and the initiatives that it introduced back in the 2015. First category are the physical impacts. So these are the obvious things that people think about: inundation, stormy weather, bushfires in some parts of the world, but then also things like bio-incursions, different pests coming into your environment, different land uses as parts of the country change, tourism impacts. So it's understanding what those impacts will be. But then coming faster than that are what we call the transition impacts. So that's really where markets, governments and customers are changing their behaviour, and particularly governments through legislation and tax imposts, the requirement for certain businesses to have emissions units under the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, the requirement to mandatorily disclose risks, which for some entities, climate-related disclosure entities, which we'll talk about in a few moments, making sure you understand those. And then the last aspect that, of course, being a lawyer, I'd add to the list is liability risk, because we are seeing around the world, actually Australia is replete with great examples. New Zealand's coming a little less quickly. Class actions, funded activists and regulators taking companies to task for not having adequately thought about these risks.
Wow.
And not factoring them into their business decision. You'll notice in all that I've said, only some of it is about your own entity's emissions. It's about the things that the planet, government, and customers or markets are going to change the environment in which you're operating that you have to have front of mind.
So as a director on one of those, on any business now, they should be thinking very much about, okay, with these, the impact, with what's happening to climate, as you say, the sorts of things that can happen with forest fires, flooding. We had our experience last year with our, the highest rainfall by far over the last, since records began, of 66 odd years ago. What impacts will those changes have on our business, on our products, on our services, on our customers, on our facilities? All of those sorts of things are what they need to be thinking about. And then, as you've said, the transitional impacts is the reactions of governments and I guess activist bodies, customer groups and so forth, how they're reacting and what impact that would have on your business. And then, of course, as you say, the historical behaviours of the business, which would give rise to these potential class actions. So some significant things for directors to think about in this environment. Yeah,
and if we just narrow in and focus on those, particularly who are borrowing or raising equity, the mandatory disclosure regime in New Zealand only applies to some entities. Basically, we've got large New Zealand listed entities, we've got large banks and insurers and large fund managers, and large here for the listed entities currently means a market cap of 60 million. In relation to those others, it's having $1 billion New Zealand dollars of assets, or in relation to insurers, 250 million premium income. But this is not a unique to New Zealand thing. So what New Zealand has done with our climate-related disclosure regime is drive off something called the TCFD recommendations, which are voluntary recommendations, which large asset managers and lenders and insurers around the world are having regard to. And so that means they're factoring into their criteria a regard to whether businesses are high emitters, but even more importantly, whether or not they've thought about the issues.
Right.
So the original origin of these requirements goes back to initiatives when Mark Carney was the Bank of England in the UK about 2015, where coming out of the GFC, he was concerned that the next big risk that was a decade or two away was not adequately being taken into account, and that started the TCFD recommendations, which was the Financial Stability Board. So you will see increasingly banks and asset managers from around the world taking into account whether the businesses they invest in have thought about these issues. And particularly insurers, and this is an issue for New Zealand, the general insurers, of course, inherently their business is understanding and pricing risk.
Yes.
And you'll see some of them have already been making comments about particular properties which are subject to inundation or flooding, and their unwillingness to insure those properties, at least for new customers, in the future, which then flows on to the issue of, can you borrow from a bank if you haven't got insurance?
Yes.
So all of these are issues that right now are on the agendas for lots of businesses in different ways.
Absolutely. And now you are alluding to the climate-related disclosures regime that we've put in place here, and initially, as you say, impacting large businesses and financial services businesses, but that's just phase one, right? It's looking to phase out to other businesses in the future. What is this regime about? What sort of disclosures are required?
So the best place to go by far is to look for the XRB's website, External Reporting Board, and their section on their climate standards. And I give them a big shout out. They've tried to write them in a way that's accessible for non-accountants, because their main job is writing financial standards.
Yes.
And then they were given the job of setting the standards for climate reporting. And they've really taken quite an innovative approach of trying to prompt those companies that are in the regime to factor the impacts that I've talked about into their strategy and their risk management processes. And in some ways that's put us a little bit out on left field internationally, because frankly, in my view, they've done a better job for scaling this for smaller entities.
Great.
And even if I was a director of an entity that is not mandatorily in the regime, I would be reading that material, which is available for free and which is a great prompt to go back to your strategy team and say, hey, if we're looking out 10 years, even looking 5 years, how is our business environment changing as a result of the physical and regulatory environment, and how are we factoring that into our plans? As I said at the outset, not only the downside risks, but also the opportunities.
Yes.
Because they're one thing, for example, New Zealand currently generates about 80% of its electricity from sustainable sources. So long as we can keep up with the demand, that gives us a profound advantage over those countries who are going to find more and more challenges in using fossil fuels. We've got a good starting point.
We have.
We're also located, frankly, in a temperate zone. If you look across to Australia and the challenges that they're experiencing, they're going to continue to experience, because they're in a hotter, drier environment, and they get issues like brownouts where electric energy is not available because everyone turned on their aircon on a still hot summer day.
Yes, absolutely. And we have had commentary about that, and there's a lot of talk at the moment about how much coal is being imported for that remaining 20%, and the more we move to EVs, the more a requirement there is for electricity, and as you say, can we keep up with demand? And we've got a really great starting point with particularly our hydro base, but an opportunity now to move more into wind and into solar. So hopefully we'll see that coming over the next few years.
And it is also, I heard a great story at the beginning of last year. I was speaking on some panels alongside someone from New Zealand Post. Now, New Zealand Post is not a entity that's mandatorily required to report because it's an SOE, although they have letters of expectation, but their board had decided 5 years ago that they would follow this journey, and they had a couple of years ago started their work, and they won't mind me sharing this anecdote because they were speaking on public platforms, focusing on their parcels business and the physical impacts on their premises. And so what they learned when we had the anniversary day floods in Auckland a year ago was exactly those sites that they had put red markers on to being potentially affected in a decade were actually the ones that were inundated in particularly West Auckland.
Yes.
And what they managed to do was, with that news when the cyclone was coming to the East Coast, they knew which parcel offices in East Coast, Hawke's Bay, particularly to say to people, hey, there's an off chance of a problem here, make sure you've got all that expensive equipment up off the floor, at least a metre or two up on shelves. And apparently that saved them a lot of money just by knowing
which
of their sites were likely to be impacted.
And that's
it's a great practical story.
Absolutely,
right?
It's a sign of great management and great governance, right? Where they're looking ahead to these sorts of risks, and this global trend of considering climate change is just elevating that.
Yeah.
And you were talking before about smaller businesses should be looking to the XRB requirements and starting to look at them now, and not just because those requirements in some form will be coming for them in phase 2 or phase 3 of this regime, but also, as in that example you've given for New Zealand Post, it's actually just good governance, just thinking ahead about these risks.
That's exactly the point. And they don't have to, they're not required to publish anything, and frankly, on many occasions, they won't want to, but starting to feed that into your strategy and risk processes early, firstly is, as you say, good business. And secondly means that when eventually the regime gets expanded to smaller businesses, you'll be in good shape.
Yeah, right. So preparing for those things now is a good way to go for so many reasons. So we have this reporting regime that's very much focused on the strategy of the business. Is that, and you talked about before about how the approach in New Zealand was a little bit more left field from other regimes. What's different about foreign regimes and climate-related disclosure?
So we're particularly seeing as the Australian equivalent is advanced, and that will give rise to a challenge in a year or so, because their regime hasn't been enacted as being mandatory yet, but the Australian Treasury has published their consultation documents. I think they're much more of, dare I say it, an accountant's document, with lots more line items specified with specific things that numbers have to be put around.
Yes.
Whereas the New Zealand approach has been, to date, more qualitative. And it will give rise, we talked about people on subsidiary boards a little while ago. It will give rise to some interesting challenges for those entities that are in the New Zealand mandatory regime and have a parent in Australia with a different regime, and they're going to have to explain actually the legal obligations on us here in New Zealand are the New Zealand regime, happy to help and cooperate, but we can't substitute the Australian requirements for the New Zealand requirements.
No, so in reality, many of those companies will have to abide by both sets of regulations.
Yeah, and that's a lot of work.
It is.
And one hopes that in time there will be a high degree of alignment. Mm-hmm. But frankly, I think it's a pity that the world is taking the more line item approach, because it's less useful as a practical guide to how to adapt your business, because this is 3/4 about adaptation and 1/4 about mitigation, in my view.
Yes, absolutely. It does create potentially, if you get consistent data, some good opportunities for academics to do some good research.
Absolutely.
But it generally does show or illustrate the difference between the Australian approach to legislation generally over the last couple of decades compared to New Zealand anyway, right? We're very principles based in New Zealand, very much about this is the spirit of what we're trying to achieve, now go and do it. Whereas Australia tends to be more along the lines of these are the things you have to do, this is how you have to do it.
I completely agree, and when we're advising, as we often are, Australian companies who have a New Zealand business, and their lawyers in Australia are saying, well, where's the requirement to do that? And we're saying, here's what it says, which is quite short, but it's inherent in what that principle means, and they are used to seeing 9 yards of detail, not just in climate. Anti-money laundering is another regime very similar. The Corporations Act, which runs to several volumes, versus our Companies Act and our Financial Markets Conduct Act, which are relatively slim,
we think
but still do the same job.
Yes.
Frankly, I think more accessible for directors who are coming new to the game. so long as they have their focus on who the key stakeholders are.
No, I really like the New Zealand principles-based approach. And when I was in law school, I remember studying the law of self-defence, background in martial arts, and so that particularly interested me. And the previous law from the 80s, there was a requirement to warn somebody 3 times before you reacted, and then the law changed now to something that is so intuitive that people on the street don't have to know what the law says for it to work in their favour. And I think that should be the way that, to a large extent, law works. If you're out there trying to do the right thing, if you're out there trying to look after your customers, if you're out there trying to act in the best interests of your company, then you shouldn't get tripped up by little details. And I think a principles-based approach really
no
enables
argument
that.
from me on that front. The reality, however, and we spend a lot of time here at MinterEllisonRuddWatts advising some of our clients on how to comply with the new CRD regime, is despite what I've said, there is a lot of detail.
Right.
And there are specific things that those entities who are in the regime have to do, and they're all working through their first reporting period now. So the reporting periods are the same as financial years, and the first applicable period was whatever financial year started during 2023. So the calendar year guys have now finished their first period and are busy preparing their reports. There are others whose financial year starts, for example, on 1 June, who are halfway through, and others who start on 1 October, who still have some leeway. But there's a lot of detail. And if on reflection, I had a probably learning is to really understand, particularly for those listed companies, how 60 million market cap actually brings in some pretty small companies.
Yes, it's a small number.
Who don't have a lot of internal compliance resource in any event. And just that there's a lot of work for them to do. So that's why it's great to see the FMA saying that what they're looking for first off is they're interested in making sure that everyone who has to file files, and that they basically had a decent go at it, and that they're not being misleading in what they disclose.
Right.
And that would then segue to a conversation about greenwashing that perhaps we can save for another day.
Yeah, interesting. So we'll start to see some of these reports come out probably next quarter then, won't we?
I think the first ones, they will be issued 3 to 4 months after the end of the financial year. So you'll see that small group who are calendar year, they will probably come out end of March, in April. Typically.
Be really interesting to see some. Lloyd, thank you again very much for your time. I'm going to finish with one other question. I actually asked you a similar question last time we spoke around the best advice you'd received in governance, but with your 25 years, a quarter of a century of governance experience, more than a quarter of a century, what is the best advice you would give to someone starting out their journey as a director?
Gosh, you ask some of the hardest questions here. I think it would be try and find someone as a mentor or just a reference point who's been around for a long time in this sphere. And I recall, first of all, a long time ago, having a conversation with a gentleman called Ian Farrant, who was on the Securities Commission at the same time as me. He had been in governance for 40 years when I was just starting out. And just sit down with them and ask them a handful of questions about tough times. Ask them about near misses. One of the things I think in New Zealand is we glamorise to some extent the role of being on a board. There's nothing more informative than learning from someone who's been through a few cycles, and we all, there's a saying about the things that don't kill you make you stronger. That's not always true, but we learn the most in life from tough times. And when you talk to someone who's been through the GFC or the dot-com bubble or even going back to the 80s,
Asian market crisis.
then buy them a coffee and listen to them. Ask no more than a handful of questions about, tell me about your near misses and your toughest calls, and you'll just learn so much.
Wow, that's a really great piece of advice. Thank you. Lloyd, again, thank you very much for your time. It's been tremendously valuable and such a great experience to talk to you. Hope we can do this again soon, and I'll look forward to seeing you next episode.
Cheers, a pleasure.